All right, welcome everyone to our expanded talk. We have a very dense February 2023 expanded series. I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Taylor Odle. Taylor is an assistant professor of education policy studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also a faculty affiliate with the Institute for Research on Poverty and the Interdisciplinary Training Program in Education Sciences. I'm curious what that institute is, Taylor. I haven't heard of, I didn't know you were involved with that. His work leverages quantitative methods and data science techniques to study issues concerning the economics of education and education policy, with a specific focus on college access and success. Taylor's work includes field experiments with national partners and quasi-experimental evaluations of existing policies to study what works in states, systems, and institutions for improving students' transitions to and through college. His work has been funded by AERA, the American Education Research Association, the National Science Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, and Spencer Foundation. And he has also been featured in The Hill, the Washington Post, Forbes, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Inside Higher Education. Before earning his PhD, Taylor led fiscal policy and research activities for the Tennessee Higher Education Commission and worked for MDRC, the National Student Clearinghouse, the College Board, and the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So I am very excited that we have the hour to spend with this expert in higher education. So Taylor, I'm going to turn it over to you for our expanded talk today.
Thanks, Jacob. What an introduction, and being in the new a Dr. Odle space feels very weird. So thanks for having me today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see this? Yes, okay. And you're seeing the normal version? Okay, sweet. I don't have any notes, but so you don't want to see blank slides. So again, thanks so much to Dr. Kirksey for the invitation to chat with you all today. I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm currently revising, so I'm looking forward to your feedback. But what I'm doing is looking at the impact of free college or promise programs on students' expectations to ever complete or kind of attain a college credential. So in the United States, we kind of have this very high value proposition for higher education, and we kind of refer to it sometimes as this great provider, right? We have lots of questions about economic mobility, about social mobility, about the value of college degrees, and we know that on average, earning some type of post-secondary credential beyond a high school diploma is associated with not only higher labor market earnings, but really positive spillovers for individuals, their communities, and beyond. However, not everyone has access to this great provider. And in the US, sometimes higher education often functions as a great divider instead. So these are data from the High School Longitudinal Study of 2009, one of the most recently tracked national cohorts of high school students. And this is the percent of ninth graders who ultimately enrolled in college within, I think, 6 or so years of high school graduation or high school beginning. So 75% is a very laudable number. However, this varies widely based on what students look like, their race or ethnicity. It also varies widely based on their socioeconomic status, and it varies widely based on where they live. And so not everyone has clear access to this great provider, particularly what you look like, what your parents do, or what they make, and where you live is a strong determinant on whether you ever enroll in college to begin with. And so some folks have characterized higher education then instead of this inequality machine that replicates and or reproduces and magnifies a lot of the inequalities that start from birth or even before. So as students kind of move through this pipeline to and through higher education, we have a lot of policies and practices that happen at the PK through 12 education space. Then maybe students move into college, and now there's a more common strand of folks moving kind of to and from versions of college and the workforce. So being retooled, beginning the workforce and coming back to college. But we know that inequality is really ripe across each of these transition and access points. And we know that there are many levers that federal government, that states, or local communities, or even institutions colleges or schools can help to maybe ameliorate some of those inequalities. And so on today's talk, we're going to really hone in on this transition from high school to college, and as students kind of prepare to make that jump into the post-secondary pipeline, whatever that might look like. But we're going to focus on kind of three big things like expectations, applications, and then ultimate enrollment. So in this high school to college transition space, this is a grossly oversimplified view of kind of the steps here. But the general idea is that students kind of go through a lot of college preparation activities. That also includes developing expectations to ultimately enroll in college or attain a college credential. Once students make that decision, they go through a really complex search process of identifying where might I want to go, where can I enroll, what types of pieces of like the puzzle do I need to put together, like test scores, letters of recommendation, and things like that. Then they go through the complex application or the process of applying. Then maybe they make a choice about whether or where to enroll, and then they ultimately show up in college. And today we're going to zoom in even further on the development of students' college expectations. And so in this expectation space, so students like the search, application, choice, and enrollment, so all the steps that happen after this, they're actually influenced by students' expectations to ever enroll in college in the first place or to ever complete a credential. So like these prior preparation steps and these post steps like searching, applying, and ultimately going to college, unequal expectations across several dimensions for students can also serve as sources of inequalities in the subsequent college access and success space. So if we're interested in equalizing educational opportunity and related economic prosperity, then we should consider the mechanisms that kind of produce these unequal college expectations. They kind of shape differences over time and the important context within which these expectations are developed for students. So this is just a descriptive look at ninth graders' educational expectations. And I've defined expectations here as wanting to attain an associate degree or higher. And this is to kind of ever attain one of those credentials. So this is again from the high school longitudinal study of 2009, but this is from the ninth grade wave. So first year high school students reporting whether or not they ever expected to attain an associate degree or higher. So 77% reported yes, they expected to attain associate BA, professional degree or beyond. But just like those ultimate enrollment outcomes, we see these really wide inequalities by student race and ethnicity. So an 18-point gap between Asian students and their Hispanic peers and their expectations to ever go on to college and complete a credential. And then a 25 percentage point gap between students from the highest income kind of tercile and students from the lowest income tercile and their expectation to ever attain an associate degree or higher. So we have these wide gaps that occur and manifest very early in the college going process before students have particularly done a lot of college preparation activities or gone through any search activities as well. So kind of helpful to step back and ask, well, what shapes educational expectations, or how do we get to this place where we have such different levels of students ever expecting to enroll in college? So as we're setting our own educational expectations or aspirations, we know there's a variety of factors that influence us, right? We not only have individual ideals or like goals or aspirations, but our family's educational level, socioeconomic status, their occupations, the plans for our peers. So are our friends going to enroll in college? What is the college going culture like in our school? What other school level factors matter, like college counseling or advising or things like that? And then at the community level resources, the presence of post-secondary options and things like that. So there's multiple like different individual factors that can influence students' educational expectations. And so when we develop our own educational expectations or aspirations, we do this kind of individually, and those expectations can change over time, but we kind of develop and change those aspirations in these kind of like nested structures. So we as an individual are inside of the family that has many important contexts and features, and our family is in part of kind of like a school setting, right, that layers on additional features or differences, and the same thing with adding on communities. And unfortunately, there are gross levels of inequality across all of these features, right? And so students could be kind of doubly advantaged or doubly disadvantaged or things like that as they go across the development of their educational aspirations or expectations in these contexts. So what can we do? So a general idea or prior works have looked to see, well, what policies or contexts seem to be kind of malleable, or how malleable are college going expectations? And so the first kind of suite of studies looks at different iterations of college access policies. And so one study of Texas's top 10% plan found that students with just the knowledge, like information that, if I'm in the top 10%, I can go to a UT institution. The students with knowledge of that were 2.3 times more likely to aspire to earn a credential than their peers without such knowledge. And the presence of college advisors has also been associated in the high school, has also been associated with higher going expectations among Latinx students. So kind of their college access policies, which we hope not only raised college going expectations, but subsequent enrollment and completion. But this points to the possibility that students' earlier expectations that then lead to these enrollment decisions can be impacted by some college access policies. We also know that financial aid programs can raise students' college-going aspirations. So a prior study found that students with college savings accounts, even after controlling for like a host of parent and psychological economic factors, that students with a college savings account were twice as likely to expect to ultimately enroll in college than students without a college savings account. And students in very diverse states, like from Indiana to Washington, prior works have found that students were between like 32 and 24% more likely to aspire to enroll in a four-year college than their peers. And so not only kind of promoting this general college access, but also putting forward some financial supports so that students then have kind of a background or like a foundation, if you will, to raise their college going expectations if they have some funds to support that journey. And then finally, changing neighborhood context can also be associated with students' college expectations. And so a prior work that was very similar, kind of similar vein to the Moving to Opportunity experiment, found that Black students who moved from high disadvantage to low disadvantage neighborhoods experienced a 31% increase in their college aspirations. And then students who moved closer to post-secondary institutions were 12% more likely to expect to earn a degree. And this was 14% more likely for students from low-income families. So kind of considering all these different contexts, what we know is that students' expectations are malleable and they can be sensitive to different types of public policies. And students from low-income backgrounds and racially minoritized students may be particularly sensitive to these changes, to ways that we can possibly increase their college expectations. So if you're in the higher education space and I say college access policies, financial aid programs, or neighborhood contexts, maybe like a light bulb kind of goes off and you think about, oh, free college or promise programs, things that combine kind of each of these features. So across the US, there's over 300, I think now maybe there's like a catalog of over 400 and something iterations of free college or promise programs across different states, regions, like cities or counties, or even institutions or high schools, with 23 states that have some form of a statewide or like developing statewide program, and then 13 more that are trying to develop one right now. And so these look very differently, but for example, in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Promise has awarded $158 million to over 10,000 students since 2007. You may also be familiar with like the Tennessee Promise, the first statewide program, and others and things like that. So what these promise programs do is they provide eligible students within defined geographic regions with some type of financial award beyond existing federal and state aid that helps them offset the costs of college. And so it's a grant aid program that either comes in at the very beginning of a student's kind of award or toward the end after they've gotten a Pell Grant and things like that. But the idea is targeting students within a geographic region with financial aid to promote their college going. And so a robust group of prior studies have found really strong impacts of promise programs on enrollment and retention, particularly for first generation, low income, and racially minoritized students. And a lot of these prior works kind of abstract away or kind of point back to, oh, these outcomes like enrollment and completion are really positive. And we are going to kind of say, well, like in part that's due to this like rhetoric around like free college. So like saying free college has some power in that. in that, oh, you like college is a next natural step for you and college is free. And so it kind of changes the college going culture. But none of these studies have necessarily tested whether or not the implementation of a free college program or kind of this free college language is really increasing students' first order educational expectations. If we know that these expectations matter for ultimate enrollment and we see enrollment increasing, then is changing expectations kind of a bigger piece or an earlier piece of the puzzle? So on this kind of college access pipeline, we know from a robust body of work that early commitment financial aid raises students' college going behaviors. Providing students with targeted pieces of information, particularly around college going, can also raise their college outcomes. And then providing kind of these systems level reforms or promoting a college going culture can be another strategy for raising expectations. And so promise programs are one unique type of program that combines each of these features, that promote a college going culture, that provides students with targeted information, and provide students with early commitment financial aid of, if you graduate, you will get this award, or this award is for you kind of to go to college. So beyond these like prior quantitative works, there's also been a host of qualitative investigations that have looked at changes in students' expectations over time that provide a really strong foundation for this work. So in Kalamazoo Promise, which is in Michigan, Miron and colleagues found that the Promise program, quote, kind of changed the equation for local youth in multiple ways, informing the culture within their educational, career, and life goals are formulated. A lot of notions that kind of this free college program increased a sense of hope, kind of increased motivations to try, opened additional doors for these students. And similarly in Pittsburgh, with the Pittsburgh Promise, students reported, oh, like the advent of this program made it more likely that I was going to go on to college, or that I had something to look forward to kind of after high school graduation. So considering these kind of like two complementary pieces of evidence, we kind of can suggest that leveraging information, financial aid, and the promotion of this college going culture, that maybe these free college programs are raising students' expectations or aspirations to go to college, potentially closing these gaps in those expectations or aspirations. And those are what therefore lead to this subsequent increase in college going or reduction in college going gaps that we've seen previously. So the study is framed in this way, and it kind of just fundamentally asks, is raising students' pre-college expectations a way through which Promise programs have seen all of these positive benefits? So we're seeing higher college going or higher college enrollment. Is it due, at least in part, to us raising students' kind of first order expectations? So the research question is, again, kind of like very straightforward. It just asks, does the adoption of a local Promise program increase high school students' expectations to attain a degree or to complete like an associate degree or higher? And because we're interested in the gaps and reductions in inequality, I also ask, does this change by race or socioeconomic status? So to do this, we kind of have to piece together several different puzzles to get at this question. And the first is that I need to first observe changes in students' educational expectations. And so I rely on the high school longitudinal study of 2009, which tracked this nationally representative cohort of students. And what I can do is see students' reported educational aspirations in 9th grade, and then again 2.5 years later, once they're in 11th grade. So I have kind of fixed students, and I can see, oh, Dr. Kirksey said that they didn't want to go to college, when they were in 2009, but then later on when they were in 2012, they had a higher level. Maybe now they want to attain a professional degree or something. But what I then also need to know is, well, which of these students in this cohort were exposed to a free college program or a Promise program? And so I rely on the PennAhead, the University of Pennsylvania Ahead Promise Program database, which tracks over 425 of these programs. And what I'm able to do is kind of subset these programs to those that are place-based. So ones that identify a very specific geographic area. So I can not only identify where these high school students are and their changing aspirations, but I can identify which of them are in regions or high schools or states that are implemented free college programs. So I know not only the year that the program was implemented, but exactly which geographic set of students would have been exposed to this program. And so I'm able to leverage kind of programs that began after students filled out that first wave of the survey. So programs that began in 2010, 2011, and 2012, and kind of lucky happenstance, some of these include some of the most popular or largest programs across the country, like the Arkansas Promise, Detroit Promise, and then Say Yes to Buffalo. So in addition to seeing like students' expectations over time and which students were exposed to these different free college programs, I can also append to these data a lot of important characteristics, kind of harkening back to our conversation before, that family context matter, community context matter, school context matter. So I can include information from the American Community Survey, Common Core data, and others that capture a host of like student, family, school, and community factors. And so I can consider students' GPA, race, gender, parents' ed attainment, income, and employment, but also the type of school students went to, whether or not there was the presence of the college advisor, the level of free reduced price lunch, and the prior college going rate for students from those schools. But I can also look at local unemployment, ed attainment, and earnings. So how are we gonna go about doing this? As I said before, we develop our college going expectations and aspirations over time. And you can imagine that as students get closer to the jumping off point or closer to high school graduation, their expectations about colleges or careers naturally change. There's some type of like secular increase in college going that we expect anyways. So as the advent of my data, I can see students' educational expectations when they're in 9th grade and again in 11th grade. And I can see when programs began in kind of 10, 11, or 12 between the periods in which students reported these educational expectations. So let's say kind of we saw this general increase in the likelihood that students expected to go to college. Oh, there's this 10-point change between kind of pre and post, if you will, implementation of a promise program. So that's kind of some suggestive evidence that a promise program may have been associated with higher levels of educational aspirations or expectations. But like I said, there's likely this belief that expectations are going to naturally increase over time, or that students in these areas may have had naturally increasing expectations as they developed, took the ACT, SAT, or other things as well. So what's helpful is that I can then leverage the rest of my cohort as kind of controls, if you will, or students who are in these regions that are not covered by promise programs that may I can use kind of their changes and expectations over time as controls. So let's say for people who or students who weren't exposed to a free college program, I can see them in 9th grade and then again in 11th grade. And so let's say, oh, maybe their kind of natural increase in expectations was about 2 percentage points. Then it's no longer kind of a 10 percentage point increase, but I would have maybe expected our 9th graders to increase about 2 points by the time they were in 11th grade. And so the delta is no longer 10 points, but it's now just 8 points. And so this is a general idea behind the identification for the impact of free college programs on students' aspirations. Also, is my screen like jittering to you at all, or it looks okay? Okay, great.
Looks great.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. My other monitor is like going crazy. So that's kind of the general setup for the identification strategy for how I'm going to estimate impacts of these free college programs. And so I'm going to use first a difference in differences design, which again tracks the same student from 9th grade to 11th grade. And I'm going to compare the change in their educational aspirations between 9th grade and 11th grade to changes in educational aspirations for students who weren't exposed to these free college programs. And so my general setup looks like this. So I have students' educational expectations. I have an indicator for students who were in promise impacted areas, which takes kind of the value of 1 for after their promise program began. I'm also able to control for like a host of those empirically guided features that are related to students' expectations. So student, parent, school, and community features that we discussed earlier. I include like a set of student and year fixed effects, kind of traditional two-way fixed effects in a difference in differences framework, but they're also helpful in absorbing these kind of time invariant student factors, so like students' gender, or like things that don't necessarily like change under repeated observations over time, or their general motivations, things like that, but also unobserved features in each of these years, like in 2009 and 2012, are things like that were common to several students in a given year, or other shocks. I also can include like these state fixed effects. And so as you can imagine, the college going culture in different states is very different, as well as the presence of other college going programs. It's like universal ACT, SAT, or like universal FAFSA, or things like that. So what I can do is include state fixed effects to restrict my comparisons to students that are within the same state context. So I have students in areas that had promise and didn't have promise, but they're under the same state umbrella, if you will. So the other features of the state can be held constant. So in addition to this like diff and diff design, I include an additional analysis that uses lag dependent variables. And so what this basically does is then say, oh, for students at a similar level of expectation in ninth grade, what is the mean difference in the expectation level once they're in 11th grade for students in promise areas compared to students in non-promise areas? So I'm basically doing is saying for students at the same expectation level in ninth grade, let's go look at them in 11th grade and compare those who are in promise zones to students who are not in promise zones. And so kind of prior in the econometric space, these lag dependent variable strategies, differences strategies have been shown to like bound the causal effective interest, where one is slightly more conservative and one is potentially a little more like upwardly biased. And so the true causal effective interest should lie somewhere in between the range of these estimates of the lag dependent variable, traditionally on the lower end, and the diff and diff estimate traditionally on the higher end. So what do I find? So just to orient you, there's two sets of comparison groups. And so the first row are comparisons for students who are, again, within the same state. And the second row is for students who are in border states. So I can compare changes for students in similar like geographic regions, but that may be within like kind of other contexts. So the last panel is the lag dependent variable estimates. And then the middle two are estimates from the differences analysis, which varies the inclusion of these like several different controls. So like it can include parent indicators and things like that, whereas just including kind of like individual student, school year, community, things like that, fixed effects. So what I generally find though is from the lag dependent variable strategy, an increase of approximately 7 percentage points in the likelihood that a student ever expected to attain an associate degree or higher. And that varies between 7 percentage points on the low end to approximately 14 percentage points on the high end from the differences strategy. So I kind of see this consistent evidence that the implementation of a free college program is associated with an increase in students' educational expectations, again, defined as having an associate degree or higher. I'm then interested in what these impacts look like for students from racially minoritized backgrounds and students from low income settings. So I find, again, evidence which is supported by a lot of those prior works we talked about, that these impacts are greater among racially minoritized students and students from low income backgrounds, where we see increases between kind of 12 to 25% for racially minoritized students and between 12 and like 17% for students from low income backgrounds. So we're not only raising, you could say like overall educational expectations, but these impacts appear to be larger for low income students and racially minoritized students, which could be suggestive of helping close some of those aspirational gaps that we previously discussed. So at the very beginning of the talk, I showed you kind of just descriptive evidence of what those ninth graders' educational expectations look like. And so this is purely, again, just descriptive of what 11th graders' educational expectations look like. So again, overall, expectations raised a little bit. If you remember, it was about 77% for those ninth graders. It's now 79% in 11th grade. So that kind of 2 percentage point increase in general. This is what the rates of expectation look like for students that are not in promise zones. So here's kind of for students that are in promise states but weren't impacted by a local promise program, it's around 80%, but we see these, again, consistent gaps for between kind of higher advantage students and students who are, higher advantage students and students who are economically disadvantaged, or between majority students and racially minoritized students. So again, gaps that show up in ninth grade are going to show up again in 11th grade at educational expectations. But for students in these promise zones, we see functionally equivalent levels of educational expectations. So 80% overall in the state, 83% for students in promise zones. So we've kind of helped equalize those expectations, if you will. We then see that racially minoritized students in promise areas and low income students in promise areas have equal, if not higher, levels of educational expectations. So you can compare kind of racially minoritized students in state to promise students, racially minoritized students in state, or low income students in state to low income students in promise zones. So pure descriptive evidence that, again, the advent of these promise programs are raising educational expectations among students overall, but predominantly among racially minoritized and low income students. And this is what those changes look like kind of from 11th grade, or from 9th grade to 11th grade. We see changes for in-state students and like border state student comparisons. We see like a lower general level for promise students in 2009. And we see functionally kind of a closing of that gap by the time these promise students are now in 12th grade by implementing kind of a promise program for them in between 2009 and 2012. Oh, sorry. And this is what those gaps, or those kind of closing gaps, look like for racially minoritized students and low income students. So consistently lower in the 2009 or 9th grade year, and either a closing of gaps, or now students who are racially minoritized or low income may even show higher levels of educational expectations overall than their peers in the state, which could be due in part to the fact that many of these free college programs are targeted specifically to students or targeted in zones that have higher populations of racially minoritized students, or are targeted in a need-based manner, so that specifically target low-income students. Kind of general question, like, what does this really mean? So kind of the project points to the fact that the adoption of these free college programs suggests that they increase local students' college expectations by around 7 to 14 percentage points. And these impacts are higher among racially minoritized or low-income students. And so kind of harkening back to like the mechanisms, it seems like these promise programs are not only combining the transition or the transmission of information, but they're also providing early commitment financial aid to students, and they're promoting this college going culture. And they're maybe doing this across several of these contexts within which students develop these educational expectations. So this mechanism, the fact that we're raising students' educational expectations, may help explain in part the large impacts that we see from promise programs on subsequent enrollment and completion outcomes in the literature. So we're kind of trying to step back and see if we can fit in some different pieces of the puzzle earlier in the process to disentangle why these programs may be operating in the ways that they are. So we're trying to make like a contribution not only to the literature, but also for policymakers and practitioners by providing like a fuller view of the impacts of these promise programs, including the mechanisms by which they're operating, to kind of think about the ongoing design and diffusion of these things. So if we think that we need to combine information, early commitment financial aid, and a college going culture across many contexts to kind of achieve this level of support or impact for students, then that means that the diversity of promise programs that exist across the country, it kind of suggests that maybe not all are going to be necessarily up to the standard. These programs are extremely diverse, and some of them do not include additional kind of college going supports, or they provide less robust financial supports for students. And so it's kind of, we need to be very thoughtful about the ways in which our programs are designed if we think that we need to meet this kind of first order outcome to then meet these subsequent level outcomes in students' search and college going process. And what we really need is like further quant and qualitative research that's trying to disentangle the mechanisms and context within which these promise programs are operating, particularly concerning not only which ones kind of like work, but which ones are working for which groups of students and which communities, and which kind of pieces or which levers are we really pulling when we implement these different types of free college programs, if we're thinking about college going expectations or college going aspirations, or things like that. So I probably spoke too quickly, but we have lots of time for questions and things, but it's a real treat to share this project with y'all, and looking forward to your kind of feedback, questions, things like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That was awesome. And we're working on, well, I guess I'm getting my first dip into a little bit of higher ed stuff. So some of my students I know on the call may have some questions about that. That's so cool. Well, I'm going to kick us off because I'm selfish, and then others, please use the chat or chime in. Taylor, could you, I guess my question is, first, like just clarification, what's the border versus the whole state again? Could you walk me through that again? I don't think I understood the two comparisons.
Yeah, so I think the general idea is to think about, oh, well, students in the state were having these like general increases in college going practices, and if I compare students in promise zones to non-promise zones within the same state, I can hold a lot of these like features constant. But I think there's a lot of movement in like the higher education space, and states are trying out like a lot of different things generally. And so I think the idea was like, oh, am I going to also just be picking up like potentially like other things that are going on in this area? And so I kind of was just trying to think like mostly for robustness, what's an alternative comparison group that I can use to see if these estimates generally make sense? And so in the higher ed space, sometimes that turns to looking to nearby states, which often have very similar higher education markets, or at least labor markets. So kind of like demand for college going and things like that look very similar. And so in those settings, we're not including like state fixed effects because I want to compare kind of across the state border for those students. So people that have promise programs here to people that don't have promise programs in another state or in a nearby state.
Got it. So you're just adjusting the fixed effect.
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
And expanding the pool of controls. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then last question is, I'm curious, and this is purely because a lot of us are in Texas, or some of us are. Do you intend to, or can you replicate the same analysis with the urbanicity? Because you showed at the beginning, there's disparities in urbanicity. I'm curious,
Yeah, I could. So I'm like restricted. And if I had a national, like a really huge national group of students, I could be able to do that. You could also theoretically do this with state administrative data in a state that had several of these like local promise programs like pop up. I am very limited in the fact that I have to use like the HSLF cohort. And so that means I'm also limited to the programs that were implemented in 2010, 2011, and 2012. And unfortunately, the sample sizes for students who were impacted by these programs that are across kind of the urbanicity gradient is just like greatly too small. Like there's basically no rural fringe or like town students that I'm really gonna be able to pick up to do like a high quality heterogeneity analysis for that.
Got it. Okay, cool. I have other questions, but I'll stop and let others ask their questions.
I will jump in really quickly because I have a hard stop in a bit. Hi, Dr. Odle. My name is Brittany Williams, and I need you to remember me because I need to be your best friend.
That sounds great. Yeah.
I am a higher ed affordability policy analyst, and so this was super interesting to me. Number one, because I'm currently working on a 10-state scan of state financial aid requirements, and so thinking through like eligibility requirements, criteria, and outreach efforts. And so when you talk about like creating college going cultures, and I'm looking at about 28 programs across 10 states, which Texas is one of the states that I'm looking at. And when you talked about like the early promise program, so Washington State has a smaller promise program, the College Bound program, where they do some of those things. And so, and I already have your paper on this particular topic, but I would love if you have some time, I'm going to reach out and just ask to pick your brain a little bit more. I'm using just NASGAP data because I wanted the the program with the least amount of exclusion for student populations. And so no like specific to STEM and stuff like that. But I just wanted to say that this was an amazing presentation and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Also, what I should say too is that, are you in Texas? Are you located in Texas? Oh,
No,
okay,
I'm
cool.
in DC.
Okay, cool. So someone who has also done work on like administrative burdens in like the free college space is Professor Elizabeth Bell, and she's actually moving to the LBJ school at UT Austin in like public policy this coming fall, I think. And so she has a body of work that looks like what is the burden for institutions kind of that operate these programs, but also what does it look like for students to go through the process of jumping these many like FAFSA application, like those different like hurdles and things like that. So it's very important work because if we make the process to take advantage of these programs too onerous, we know from I think cost and complexity of financial aid, studies that it doesn't have the intended outcome that it should.
Thank you.
I had a question about a comment you made about which programs work for which groups of students. Are you able to see some trends about the effectiveness of different types of programs, and what elements do those programs contain?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and that was kind of the plan. So I like captured all of these features of different programs, like first dollar, last dollar. Do they have college going supports or not? Are they like starting like very early in high school or even in middle school to kind of like change their college going pipeline? And the same unfortunate answer goes back to the same answer that I gave Jacob earlier, in that there's just not enough diversity in the few programs that were enacted in this short period of time to be able to really confidently say that these types of programs lead to greater impacts for like these types of students. I think if we like, kind of like zoom out, and we're not only looking at educational expectations or aspirations like here, there is kind of a robust body of work, not only in the promise space, but also just in the financial space, aid space too, right? That like need-based programs are going to be on average have higher effects on enrollment or like access. And so I would posit they have higher impacts on expectations as well than merit-based programs, right? And more universal programs are going to have higher impacts than kind of more specifically like targeted programs, if you will. And so I think that's definitely an area that I'm particularly interested. Again, I think the rub just comes with thinking about where we can observe changes in these expectations or aspirations over time for enough students across enough diversity of these program types. I think also a lot of folks are really interested in heterogeneity in these different iterations of promise programs. But the problem is there's almost too many buckets of them, right? Like functionally no promise program is the same as another promise program. So they may have these like common, so Laura Perna and Elaine Lee from Penn, they kind of created this promise program typology where they fit several programs into these like general buckets, like 5 or 6 buckets based on kind of where they were targeted, how they were funded, first dollar, last dollar, like all of these things. But even if you go inside of one of those buckets that we would think about doing an analysis with, programs can be extremely diverse. And so then it's very unclear whether or not you're picking up differences, what difference you're picking up. Is it the first dollar, last dollar difference? Is it the support or no support? Is it the kind of community-based program? Is it the school-based program or things like that? And so I think that's maybe why we haven't seen so much focus in the promise space on which programs work for more or less for which types of students, because we don't really have groups of programs that we can look at together and compare to other groups of programs. We kind of have one program we're comparing to kind of one other program.
Did you parse that out, like whether the programs were first dollar programs or last dollar programs, and like what that meant for the definition of free college?
Yeah, so both the PennAhead Promise Program database and the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research in Michigan, they also have a free college database. And I believe both of those allow you to not only capture all this information, but you can like filter by them as well. So you can filter by like the scholarship requirements, if there's residency requirements and things like that too. And so yeah, I was able to capture all of that as well.
Is that publicly available, or you had the access to it for this project?
Yeah, I can put the link in the chat too.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Taylor, so again, this is like Texas, like magnified in the Texas context, but I think it's a trend nationally as well. I know you did a really good job of telling us at the beginning, like what you meant by the post-secondary expectations. And like, I know you're limited in HSLS, right? And can't necessarily look at like, you know, are you kind of really into this for like that 4-year degree versus like a stackable credential, like that type of stuff? I'm curious because I am not a higher education expert and you are. Do you think if let's pretend you had all these amazing state longitudinal data systems and you were looking at them all at the same time, so you could look at, you could get that heterogeneity that you wanted, have access to all these different programs. I'm just curious, do you think that it changes, like, or what changes if you move the conversation away from like a general degree, like an associate's and higher versus like, I'm just thinking like early college, high schools, and like other things, or I mean, that's kind of like a throwaway because that's the expectation, is that you get something at the end of it. But I'm just curious, like just like skill-based certificates or industry-based credentials,
Yeah.
any of that stuff. Like, does that
Yeah.
change any of what you
You
would
know, I mean,
expect to see?
I think that it could. And so I'll also say, like, in the perfect world with all those data that you just mentioned, we would also be able to look at kind of this measure of college expectations, just like associate or higher, is a very like blunt measurement, right? But that's also because of the fact that several of these programs only pay for for enrollment at 2-year colleges. Several of them may pay for like a full 4-year degree or something like that as well. And so an interesting research question would be to split those apart and say, what's the impact of this BA plus targeted program versus the impact of this AA kind of targeted program? Because we should expect that those things would be very different as far as we think about expectations. And so the same goes like kind of further, shorter time-based programs. If there are programs that specifically only target like certificates or shorter long-term certificate programs or things like that, you should expect that we would also maybe probably see the same thing there as well. And so, yeah, like in places like Tennessee, you can use Tennessee Promise to do like, community college associate degree, but you can also do like short-term credential certificates, technical things like that as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's all in, if the messaging is so powerful, then yes, how we're messaging and what we're telling them, what level to expect, it's kind of like we're almost setting it. Like, oh, we're going to pay for 2 years of college. Like that's the foundation, right? Or we're going to pay for a short-term certificate. So that's the foundation. Or we're going to pay for a BA. So like that's the new foundation. And so I think that theoretically, yes, students' expectations should change based on what we're telling them their expectations should be, right? And so I think that, however, comes with like this differentiation across all these different programs and across all these different states. Like, what do we really care about? But no, I think these programs could be particularly powerful for like more technical or industry-based credentials, for sure.
Yeah, I guess I asked, because your point is a poignant one, and in looking at the heterogeneity by the student subgroups, because really, like I see programs like this as, the inspiration is to help students who were never going to go to college in the first place, right? Like that was not part of the trajectory. And so I think that's really interesting. And I think at least in Texas, a lot of the way that we are getting more of those students to go into post-secondary is equipping them with as much in high school before they even leave, and then making that bridge, I think, becomes easier, even if it is that they're just coming away with a lot of dual credits and getting really close, or an actual degree itself and then continuing on. So very, very interesting.
At risk of
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
ahead.
At risk of sounding ignorant, I'm curious about your methodology. You used a diff and diff and the lag dependent variables. So is that working similarly to propensity score matching somewhat?
So I guess you could think about the lag dependent variables in a similar way, in that, let's say for like propensity score matching, the idea there is to say what features of me or of all of us are associated with us being exposed to treatment. And so we want to match people at the same level of expectations. And so if I had done propensity score matching here, what I'd basically be doing is saying matching students who have the same propensity to be exposed to a promise program. Whereas instead, what I'm doing is basically propensity score matching matches students on exposure to treatment. And so lag dependent variables is kind of matching students on prior outcomes.
Okay.
So I was saying is say, oh, so Angela and Jacob had the same aspirations in 9th grade, but Joe and I had different aspirations, but we were also different in 9th grade. So I can say, oh, between Angela and Jacob, what's the difference in aspirations in 12th or 11th grade for them versus the difference in aspirations for Joe and I in 10th grade. So I basically say, like, for students in 9th grade who said they didn't want to do any college, I look at those students in 12th grade to see where the changes for promise or not. For students who already said they wanted to do, AA or higher, what's the difference in their AA or higher level in 11th grade? So it's kind of like saying, for the college goers already, what was the impact? for the non-college goers already, kind of like what was the impact, if that makes sense.
As that was a great, clear answer. Thank you.
Okay, great.
About 5-7 minutes for other questions if anyone has any. Yeah, Taylor, I mean, I'll just ask the question, what's next? You know, so you said this is kind of work in progress. Do you have additional plans like in these data, or is this kind of done and you're tying a bow on it? I'm just curious if you like where you're going to take this after this. I think all I hear from Jen is that there's new HSLS data, but I have no idea if that's even useful data or like whatever. So I'm just curious if you have next steps.
Yeah, so I think like, so I'm revising this at a journal right now. So hopefully that will I can tie the bow on that kind of like sometime this semester. I think that would be it for like this data set. I think the only other opportunity is to find kind of potentially a national partner that has some type of, survey of students or things like that that captures these expectations, to then be able to drill down and think about the heterogeneity across program types, across students, across urbanicity and things like that as well. I don't know of any states though that really do that. And so it almost have to be some type of nonprofit that has kind of connections to students' aspirations over time or something like that. And this kind of also is just like a continuation of my general work on free college programs. So I looked at like changes in students' financial aid awards and kind of displacement, if you will, when free college programs occur. I've also looked at like institutional behavior, like how do colleges spend differently or how do they staff differently when there are free college programs in this way. But it kind of is also just situated in my like larger body of work on this transition from high school to college and how we can help reduce like some of these inequalities. And so I may do work in the future though on students' college plans or like their aspirations, because it appears as though this early piece of the puzzle really matters and can help potentially structurally reduce some of these inequalities we see in other college going outcomes and things.
And so I'll ask the ignorant question again, as not the higher ed expert. So you're interested in the expectations piece, and you presented that is clearly also connected to what we actually observe of students, like once they get the degrees. Is there variation there in terms of like what they get? Like, I'm curious if like, because I think like the unintended consequences argument would be like, okay, students are getting, like, we're spending all this money on these programs, students are getting like degrees that are not translating into like desirable like labor market outcomes or whatever. I'm sure that's like a very ignorant bastardization of what's happening, but I'm just curious, like, if you know from previous research or like what does that variation look like in terms of like what students actually earn, and are there differences by student subgroups?
Yeah. So I think for all like promise program studies, there's always, it seems, consistently larger impacts for low income students and especially Black and Hispanic students. There's work in Michigan with the Kalamazoo Promise, again by the W. Upjohn Institute, that looked at individuals who were impacted by the Kalamazoo Promise, or maybe even like the Detroit Promise, or both. It shows that they were more likely to kind of stay in the state workforce after the program, and they were more likely to have higher wages than their peers. And so there is, I think, but I think that follows along like the general increase in human capital leads to these positive individual and like kind of collective benefits over time. So I guess what you could do with HSLS is look at degree completions, but the time window is like fairly short, I think. So you could see like, I guess an earlier first order question is, yes, there's students' expectations, but we could directly link that to enrollment. So not only did we then, like, what's kind of the fall off, right? Like if 70% of students say that they want to enroll in college, what percent of them actually ultimately enroll? And so we could kind of track the like waterfall, if you will, of these students. And so I think that would make a lot of sense. But my read of the literature right now, though, is that just like general financial aid programs, promise programs are moving students into institutions, they're promoting their degree completion, which generally leads to positive kind of labor market earnings. I think the only like potential downside that's been noted in some places is like a displacement or a redirection of students from 4-year institutions to 2-year institutions. In Tennessee, there was a study that showed that like the community college had this huge surge in enrollment, and it was like a really small, it was like 2% reduction in 4-year college enrollment, but that was really short-lived. And then the students who moved into 2-year were slightly more likely to transfer to 4-year. And so I think helpful in that way. So you could think if students were going to go to a 4-year and they only went to a 2-year, then on average, they would have lower earnings than they would have had for their counterfactual. But I think most of the play that promise programs are having is in what you said earlier, in pulling students into the college going pipeline. So the counterfactual was no college and getting them to do a 2-year or above degree, versus I'm less concerned about moving students from, I think, like 4 years to 2 years, because I don't think that's happening as much as maybe we would talk about it as happening.
That makes me think of Angela's dissertation defense in a week, where she's presenting some really interesting, cool stuff on undermatching in Texas. So very cool. So in the chat, Corinne said, I have always been curious about the percentage of students that have been given the opportunity for a promise program that choose to take advantage of these programs.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not familiar with any research, but that would be interesting to see, like, oh, for a whole area, what number of students, you know, especially for like the programs that are like, if you graduate from this high school or something like that. I guess it'll be interesting to see, like, yeah, what percent of those ultimately, yeah, like participate in the program. But I think to the question earlier too, like, that's probably a direct function of getting information out about these programs, but also making sure that these programs don't have so many hurdles for students to be able to take them up. Right. So I think that that's a good question. Yeah. And we should systematically think about increasing the take up of these programs, because the students who aren't taking them up are likely the ones that stand the most to benefit from them.
That's interesting. Yeah. Any last questions for Taylor before we wrap up? Okay, cool. Well, thank you again, Dr. Odle. This was so cool, methodologically rigorous, cool data, really great, helpful background of the literature, in particular for someone who's mostly in K through 12 space. So thank you again for sharing your time with us. And for everyone else, this recording will be posted on our website like it always is. Looking forward to seeing some of you tomorrow, maybe for our brown bag talk. That's actually in person, but we are streaming via Zoom. And thanks again. Yeah, we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for the invitation. Bye, y'all.